So I want to say hello and to welcome everyone to tonight's Wheaton Conversation with Kayla Cantu. And my name is Marcy Peterson. I'm the Marketing Technology Director here at WheatonArts. I'm a white female in my mid-50s with brown hair, and I'll be mostly off camera tonight. I am broadcasting from southern New Jersey, traditionally known as the land of the Lenape, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'd again love to hear from everyone in the chat tonight. Let us know not only where you're listening from, but I'd love to know how you heard about this program. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the evening for your technical and general questions. So feel free to write to me there. But if you want to ask Kayla some questions, you can ask her in the Q&A. So there's those two places for you to write in. Also, you have control of what you see this evening. So there's two little lines that you can see between the speakers and the presentation. So you can pull that back and forth if you are on an actual computer. You're a little more limited if you're on a cell phone. But to start the program, we want to thank our program sponsors, PNC Arts Live and the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass. I'd also like to remind you, in order to keep free programs like this going, we need your support at WheatonArts. You can do that through membership, donations, and shopping. And now I will turn this over to my coworker, Pamela Wheaton, the arts administrator and who is a ceramic artist, arts administrator and educator. And over to you, Pamela.
Thank you, Marcy. The introduction was great. And hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with you. As Marcy said, my name is Pamela Wheaton. I'm the Director of Education and Artist Services at Wheaton Arts and Cultural Center. So I have the pleasure of meeting people like Kayla all the way through application process into our fellowship program, all throughout their time here and through programs such as the one that you are watching right now. I'm a white female in my mid-30s with long brown hair and blue eyes. Tonight I'm wearing a gray cardigan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I also recognize that I am broadcasting from southern New Jersey, traditionally the land of the Lenape. During our program, I do invite you to ask questions using the Q&A feature. That's where I will be checking to see if you have any questions to ask Kayla as she's presenting. And as they come in and as they are relevant to the topic being discussed, I will pose them to Kayla and she can answer them directly. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to formally introduce Kayla. She describes herself as a biracial, bisexual, fat female artist, writer, and educator who utilizes glass, video, photography, and mixed media. Even when absent, glass inspires her work by relating qualities of glass to the human body. Through questioning society's traditional understanding of normality and abnormality, her practice explores curiosities of discomfort surrounding unruly bodies and perceptions of identity. Kayla is currently a fellow at Wheaton Arts and Cultural Center, and she will be with us until early July. Kayla, thank you so much for joining us, both in the fellowship and in this program.
All right, Pam, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I would also like to first begin by saying thank you to Wheaton Arts for having me as a fellow here. And thank you to all the staff, administration, everyone in the studio for making me feel so welcome from the very first moment I stepped through the doors. So I'm excited to spend the remainder of my fellowship here and get to connect with more people. All right, so let's go ahead and get this started.
We are so happy to have you.
Thank you. All right, so my name is Kayla Cantu. And I've been asked a couple of times various ways to describe myself. Most recently, the question I was asked was, if I was a house, how would I describe myself? And the house I would pick would be Gru's house from Despicable Me, both on the outside and on the inside. And another thing that I like to ask people is, if you could describe yourself, what food would you be? And I, of course, got asked the same question, and I would describe myself as a pickle. And I will let everyone sort of interpret that within their own way. But realistically, when I'm not being a Gru house or a pickle, I am originally from a very small town in Texas called George West, Texas. It was labeled the storytelling capital of Texas, which I think that itself might be just a big story. So there's that. And I am an avid animal lover. It seems that I sometimes relate to animals, well, often relate to animals more so than I do people. These are my birds. I'm a crazy bird lady. This is my perfect child, Remy, and every family has to have bad kids. These are the two bad children that always make terrible decisions, but you love them anyways, so it's okay. But as far as actually starting out with glass, I received my BFA at West Texas A&M University. And at first I started off in the hot shop, kind of just trying to experiment, trying to learn to blow glass. And later on, sort of towards the end of my BFA degree, I switched to kiln casting, doing very rudimentary kiln casting because I was really interested in just trying to learn the technical side of what it took to, I guess, be a kiln caster, so to speak. And my next steps were to go to graduate school. And I went to Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. And that is where I really honed in on being a kiln caster, trying to make that my predominant way of working with glass. Something I will say is that I was very interested in the hot shop, of course, whenever I first started, but I could never really pinpoint why. I found myself in a position to where I kept wanting to work with this material, but I had no intention as to the reasons as to why I was doing it. I wouldn't say that I was a person who enjoyed glass from the moment I stepped in the hot shop. As a matter of fact, I rather disliked it. But apparently, I liked the toxic relationship. I don't know what else to say about that, and I stuck with it. And I could never figure out this reason as to why I was working with glass. I still had no clue at all, even halfway through graduate school. And it did take me a very long time. I realized that it was very frustrating for me working with the material. I started becoming very frustrated with myself, especially because of the high failure rate of kiln casting. It was a struggle, that's for sure. But something that I came to terms with later is this idea of an unruly body. And I have to say, I first heard this term unruly body whenever I was listening to an audiobook of Roxane Gay's memoir of My Body Hunger. And Roxane Gay describes himself as a Black lesbian woman who exists within a fat body. And this memoir really fueled and inspired my work in ways I didn't expect. And this idea of this memoir combats this idea of what society, at least Western society, deems as normal, or something that's conforming to a type, standard, a regular pattern. It's characterized by what is considered usual, typical, or routine. And this term unruly body, the way that Roxane Gay describes it, is words that are associated with bodies that do not fit the mold of what society deems as acceptable or normal. And it was within this that I felt like I was looking in a mirror. I realized that I was looking in a mirror, yes, pun intended, because glass is a mirror, but whenever I was working with this material. And I realized that I could see myself in the material, and I was finally able to realize why I decided to work with glass. It was a very humbling experience. And I associated this idea of process and what it's like to fill voids through the process of kiln casting. So the way I think about kiln casting is, you make a sculpture out of wax or clay, you do the whole mold thing, you make a mold, you melt the wax out, you dig the clay out. It's a very long and tedious process, and it gives you a lot of time to self-reflect. At least that's what I found in it. And within this idea, including it being another idea of this high failure rate, like even charging a kiln, you can mess it up. You're constantly going into different holes of the flower pot, holes of opening the kiln, trying to figure out ways not to mess up the process. And thinking about this idea of all of this time, even crashing a kiln in hopes of maybe having a decent result at the end. And this is where, before I actually turned the kiln on, but sort of getting ready to do the thing. And I think a lot about kiln casting and relating it to this idea of different binaries. And the kind of person I am, I have to make lists in order for me to find common denominators of what I am interested in, not just as a person, but as an artist. So within this case, I have made a Venn diagram, and this section that is has a terrible attempt at a red circle. These are the things that I found that I don't fully know how to feel about. I call it the zone of uncertainty, is the best way I can describe it. And they are things that myself, or maybe even other people, can find uncomfortable, vulnerable, spiky, or just different, so to speak. And I realized that I have to be okay with being uncomfortable. And I have to be okay with this idea of vulnerability. And with the type of person that I am, it's very hard for me to be vulnerable, but I've come to learn that apparently that's what my practice is about. And now we're getting to a bit of the physical work. So this work, Sweet Release, essentially what this is, it was my attempt at trying to understand why I was working with glass, and it was an attempt to sort of purge my negative feelings about the hot shop and my ideas of not fully being able to understand why I couldn't work with the material. So again, I had no idea initially why I was working with it, but in the hot shop, we often compare the viscosity of glass to honey whenever it's in its molten state. And I started doing a lot of research, and I realized that honey was actually used as currency in ancient cultures, such as ancient Egypt. It was also found in tombs buried with pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings. And I was really interested in this idea of the sense of loss of worth through materiality, through honey itself, and how I associated loss of worth in my attempts in the hot shop within myself. I also found inspiration through this legend of this idea of mellified man. So essentially what this legend is, it's the story of monks who would, when they were getting towards the end of their life, consume nothing but honey. And that was all. They wouldn't drink anything, they wouldn't eat anything, just honey. And of course, eventually they passed away because you're not really supposed to do that in order to survive. So whenever these monks passed away, according to this legend, they would be sealed in a tomb, embalmed with honey. The tomb would be cracked open 100 years later. And what was supposedly left was supposed to be a honey-infused crystallized skeleton, and that would then be ground up and used for medicinal purposes. Now, of course, this is a legend, but I drew inspiration from that in the sense that there is something that this idea of preservation and this idea of trying to preserve your sense of self-worth. So in place of glass, because I prefer to not get third-degree burns or probably worse, I decided to bathe myself in honey and focus on the areas of my body that I've always had body image issues with. And this was an attempt to cleanse myself of these impure thoughts, essentially. I also like to try to work with other materials. So this is my work prod that is photography printed on silk, and then it is hung on the wall with boob tape or trans tape. And this is my belly button. I have used pointed glass rods to obscure the original landscape of my stomach in an attempt to try to see something new or create something new in this already jaded perception that I had of myself, and that sometimes, well, a lot of times other people have of themselves as well. There we go. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit over this video just because it takes a second to get started. But at the time, whenever I made this video, I was vegetarian. I also had this weird disgust for deli ham. I remember watching an episode of Monsters Inside Me, and someone got a tapeworm from eating deli sliced ham, and it just irked me in every way possible. So making this video itself at the time was very uncomfortable for me because I felt like a terrible human chewing up meat whenever it's not what I ate. But I've come to terms with the fact that, again, I have to be uncomfortable in order for me to process things that I am going through. All right, I will pause it. I think we get the gist. I will not make everyone, watch the full 2 or 3 minutes of this. Oh, maybe it wants to play on its own. Let's try it again. All right, and that's just a screenshot of sort of the end result of the video, the mass of meat that's been left over. All right. This is another performance work that I have done. These are just stills that have been spliced together, but essentially what I was trying to figure out is how different ways that I could obscure my identity. And this is basically a flexible screen. And throughout the duration of this video performance, I'm trying to burst through this flexible screen. And this idea of obscuring my identity and trying to have this rebirth of what I could potentially be in the future, or other ways that I could try to view myself. I'm also really interested in this idea of a barrier being a portal, and how sometimes portals are inaccessible. You're sort of denied this full access. And these are stills of another video performance. All of these performances, there are links to them on my website. But I was really trying to figure out how to make artwork whenever the pandemic hit, initially back in 2020. So in an attempt to be productive and in an attempt to try to figure myself out a little bit more as a human, I suppose, I did an online video performance. And what I did was, this is called 20-day consumption. So I wrote down everything I consumed of every day for 20 days. And then I blended that physical documentation into a cake, and I ate it in front of a live video performance as I was watching an episode of American, I believe it's Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. And with this, I was interested in leaving things up to chance. So I had my cat running around, doing her normal cat things, being a menace. I left my phone on in case someone called me, and I basically just pretended that the online audience was not there, and I was just going about my daily life. And reflecting on it now that's in the past, now that I've had some time to process things, it's always curious to think about, like what you are not supposed to eat a lot of, what you are supposed to eat, and how sometimes, depending on what you eat at a certain time of day, people will act like it's a bad thing potentially, and you might have to keep it like a dirty little secret. It was something that I was trying to learn to process. And another thing that I realized is I don't always have to use glass within my practice. For me, glass is home. And if I ever go on an adventure, I can always come back home. So for this work is titled A Barrier Between You and Me. And this again, of course, like happened whenever COVID first hit, but I wasn't really thinking of the pandemic and this idea of I'm going to get sick necessarily. I was more so interested in the idea of how skin, the color of your skin tone, the way you look on the outside, or anything really, physicality can act as a barrier between you as a person and people viewing you. So it's really interesting to have this idea of you being content that can also view other content, and having this ability to view yourself outside of yourself. And what that was, what that was, basically I'd taken a mold off of my body. I had covered it in latex, and then I just peeled that skin off. So while my body has been morphed, it is still me. And it was just a way to process how I thought the way that I look, or how the way other people look, can act as a barrier from other people getting to know them. This is a giant mold, my biggest mold I've ever made so far. That was a beast, and trying to figure out how to do technically, it was a struggle. But yes, and I was really interested in this idea of like the process of filling a void, and the process of how I relate physically filling a void into ways that I fill voids within myself. And acknowledging the fact that sometimes things happen, things go awry, and you just have to go with the flow. This was a massive failure, but it was productive and generated some great things for technically wise, and also conceptually later on in my practice. And as a result, this isn't the piece that was in this previous slide, but Again, I'm really interested in this idea of kiln casting and even combining other materials and just seeing what they do. What are the materials doing together and separately? This is sort of a series. This is called Suck It In, study number 1. And this is kiln cast glass, honey, and fat. So there's a hole in the center and it oozes honey onto the floor. And whatever is left on the floor, it just stays there. I was really interested in this idea of this act of weeping and how our bodies, not just, whenever you cry, but how we constantly ooze all of the time. We sweat. If we're sick, we have snot come out of our nose. All of the things that you don't want to talk about are things that I'm really interested in. And this was, again, it was a study. So this one is Suck It In, study number 2. And I was interested in this idea of also combining latex with it serving as a barrier between the wearer and the person who is, trying to get past this barrier in some context. So what I did was I actually got a bunch of condoms and I cut them up, wrinkled them up, and sort of placed them on this work for decoration in an attempt to maybe hide some imperfections. And again, thinking about this idea of oozing in conjunction with both of these materials, the glass and the latex. I have honey that drips over everything and again, leaves a puddle on the floor. This is another work that sort of came after the previous 2. It's called Seep. And in this instance, the latex serves as a window to the inside contents of the kiln cast glass. And again, it's about honey oozing, but also having this sort of privilege of being able to see the worth, so to speak, inside. And I was thinking about this idea of the slow drip, how long it takes to lose your self-worth. Sometimes it can be instantaneous depending on what you have going on in your life. But a lot of the time I found, at least for me, it's about things that happen slowly that sort of build up pressure. And I've just been trying to find ways to flip that on its head.
Kayla, I have a question that came from the audience. Do you, and it seems relevant here, do you think of eyeballs as a glass or a portal that also keeps you inside, as well as letting others see some aspect of you?
I do think of it as, for me, I think of eyeballs, I love that question, as a portal. And my reasoning behind that is because I go back to this idea of we are intelligent beings as humans. We have feelings. We perceive the outside world a certain way. And at the same time, through looking at other people, and even whenever you have those moments of, like, let's say you make eye contact with another person, I've often found that you can see expression and emotion in other people's eyes, and it's like a portal into what they're thinking to some degree. I have a little bit more trouble reading people for other reasons that I'll talk about in a little bit, but I do think of it as a portal. And for this work, this was, I'll say to an extent, it was not intentional. Whenever I first decided to make this piece in actual artwork. So I was really interested in trying to figure out different textures I could get with kiln cast glass, and trying to find ways to highlight the process of kiln casting within my artwork. And again, this piece is all about texture. So I found that through a happy accident initially, that with the certain glass that I use, devitrification actually caused the glass to look like stretch marks or imperfections. And I realized that with this specific glass, the Divot looked a lot like stretch marks that I had within my own body, on the landscape of my own body. And I found that to be really exciting. And this was an attempt at not just an ode to kiln casting and the process itself, but an ode to highlighting the imperfections and thinking about maybe sometimes these mistakes are more interesting than your intent and can prove to be very fruitful. And whenever I was installing this from the wood floor, I left a bunch of kiln brick dust everywhere, and I just thought this was a really beautiful image. And another thing that I'm really fascinated with is the aftermath of effects in relation to the body, and in this case, to bring it full circle, in relation to the installation and deinstallation of this work. I love this idea of remembering something that once happened. And currently what I'm working on here at WheatonArts, I am playing. This is not at WheatonArts. This was at a different studio, but something that I was sort of forced to do, but was really excited to do. In my graduate school, we took in part of the hyperopia projects. And a friend and I decided to, I think it's called Hear No Evil, See No Evil. So one person had headphones on. They couldn't hear what you were saying. The other person, like in this instance, I had something covering my eyes, and we had to make an object with both of these things sort of impairing us to some degree. And we made a cup. It was very ugly, but it was a lot of fun to make. And again, with this idea of play, I constantly have to remind myself, and the first person who really taught me that I need to learn to play within my practice was Laura Donifer. She was a visiting artist in my undergrad, and I loved that woman whenever she came, because I remember her taking big gathers of glass and getting all this texture by rolling all the glass on a blowpipe on the floor. And that's something I didn't think you were allowed to do, but she did it. And then there was this big glass, smaller, big glass fashion show at the school that she put on, and it was crazy and it was amazing. And lastly, very recently, actually, whenever I was at Senior College this past year, Bo Young came to visit as a visiting artist, and just his personality and the way that he approaches glass was so playful. We essentially made these glass tubes, and we got bottle rockets, and you would light them, and then it would be like a bottle rocket roller coaster. And this is him running away. Sorry, Bo, if you happen to be here, but I had to include this because it's pretty amazing. And again, with this idea of play, whenever I feel stagnant in my work, I always look at those images so I can just remind myself that I have to play within my practice in order for me to be productive. And the idea of play within your practice can look different for everyone. No one has the same practice. So my version of play was, I'm really interested right now in this idea of holes in relation to human bodies in general, but also holes that you find out in nature. And this is a wasp nest that I ordered off of eBay. I didn't know you could buy that, but apparently you can. And I was really interested in this idea of, wow, these things are abandoned. This is like an abandoned home. This is an abandoned safe space. And I'm wondering what I can do with this. And I have been covering them in wax. So another thing that I sort of have this fear of are a bunch of holes clustered together. I have had this recurring dream to where I wake up and there's a bunch of holes, like millions of holes in a certain part of my skin. And like whenever I'm not dreaming, I have really sensitive skin. So if I ever get a bug bite, it's going to be a scar on my body forever. So thinking about this idea of imperfections like on my own skin and how other people might think a similar way. And something I found interesting, I made the mold of that previous piece, and whenever I melted the wax out and took out that little section of the cut up wasp nest, this was the result in the mold. And I decided to include this because for me, it reminded me of clusters of little teeth. And I thought that was interesting within itself. And for me at Wheaton, I'm really trying to focus on playing, of course, but also like just finding interesting things through happenstance. This is another wax that I've been working on. And it was actually funny. I posted this to my Instagram story, and another friend who has this similar fear. These are often the responses I get. And I think those are my favorite types of responses, of me saying that they hate it. So I guess it works in my favor. And another really fun thing that I've discovered at Wheaton. So there's this wax in one of the roasters. I went to recycle it, but I found that whenever I was trying to recycle wax and cool it down into like basically a square to remelt later after I cleaned it, it's a mixture of a bunch of waxes, I'm assuming. I don't know what it is. It's a mystery wax, but I love it because it does not want to cool evenly. And you get all of these really interesting textures that I think remind me of like fabric or skin folds. This is whenever it is starting to cool. This is a random pattern that just sort of appeared whenever I came back a little bit later, and it had fully cooled down. And this is the inside of the roaster whenever it cooled down. And I'm really wanting to, within probably tomorrow, actually try to find a way to pop this out of the roaster and use this within my artwork somehow. I'm also figuring out ways to use other parts of the body, such as many nipples. I've recently been thinking about the small, like maybe small gestures can be just as important as big gestures. And oftentimes they're overlooked, but while they could be equally as important, I often wonder if they're more important than grand gestures. So that's sort of what I'm thinking. I don't know how these live yet, but again, I'm figuring it out. I'm also, again, I'm still working on bigger pieces too. The other ones that I have been playing with will probably be like smaller scale, but this is a wax that I've been working on for a while. While I've been here, I made a mold out of it. It is currently in a kiln at top temperature about right now. So after this presentation, I'm going to go check on it and make sure my baby is alive. So I also have been working on other things, sort of tests to see what will happen. I've been doing a lot of different types of mold making. So I came with this wax intact. It got damaged due to my own fault a little bit whenever I had shoved my whole life in my truck and came to New Jersey for the fellowship. So I fixed it up. I made a rubber mold. I made a mother mold, and I'm now in the process of trying to logistically figure out how to make a mold of it, a plaster silica mold to actually put glass into. I'm also using this time to try to finish up work that I haven't fully finished yet. So this is a casting that I've been procrastinating finishing just because it's a bit intimidating, I suppose, but trying to finish cold working it and getting it to where I feel like it can be finished. so to speak. And to sort of wrap up, I've learned to always make room for the unexpected, and no matter what you do. And sort of talking, I guess, again, a little bit about COVID. Whenever COVID hit, it gave me a lot of time to think about, where do I fit in within the glass community? Everyone in the world to some extent was isolated, not knowing what to do. And I, again, trying to find ways to still be active within the glass community, I came to realize that I didn't know where I fit in necessarily. And the reason for that is because I just felt like to some degree I didn't belong. So I'm biracial. My dad is a tall Mexican man. My mom is very short. She is a white lady. I look like neither one of them. I'm also a part of the LGBTQ community. I also exist within a body that is not, I am not thin by any means, and that's okay. But I can also acknowledge the fact that I am not someone who you would see in Vogue magazine. And most recently, something that I learned not that long ago after talking to many specialists, that this idea of neurodiversity, that I am on the autism spectrum. And for me, it explains a lot as to why I tend to gravitate towards certain things, why I tend to hyper-focus on certain ideas within my practice. And sometimes I dig myself into a hole, and it takes someone telling me something obvious for me to get out of it, amongst many other things, of course, in relation to what this means for me. And I also was thinking about how I've never felt comfortable in the hot shop, not just because of the heat factor, but also because it can be very overwhelming for me for various reasons. And it makes it interesting because I'm also an educator, and I think it's maybe this shift in what the purpose of doing something is. So for example, like in public demonstrations, I mask and I am able to push through it, okay, but by the end of it, I'm mentally exhausted, and that's okay. I just process things maybe in my own way, but this idea of being watched is something that I struggle with, and it has a lot to do with the work I make for my practice. And I kept wondering throughout this whole thing, all these things put together, like, do I belong? And if there were other people who felt this way for other reasons, who are these people? Who are these artists? And something going into this project, this idea was, I was trying my hardest to find people to make me get past these thoughts. And I found Audre Lorde, who would encourage a celebration of the differences that society instead uses as tools for isolation. So Audre Lorde describes himself as being a Black lesbian warrior poet. I loved that quote that they gave in one of their statements. And it's something that I try to hold close whenever I feel like I'm a bit lost in my practice. And that culminated in this article that I wrote for the Glass Art Society news publication. I titled it Another Artist at the Table. So the focus of this was finding underrepresented emerging artists who were trying to define their own definition of success and combat this idea of imposter syndrome. And ultimately, within this, maybe this was an avenue for people who felt maybe similar feelings like I did, for all of us to maybe find a community within our differences to celebrate those differences instead of using them as a way to cast people out. This is a working title. but I didn't feel like the article was enough. I felt like it was a little too abbreviated because it's supposed to be an article, but I've decided to make this my own project and expand on the article. So far, it's entitled Glass Voices. That, of course, can change, but essentially what I've been doing is cold calling, researching people who are underrepresented, who are emerging artists, and asking, hey, would you like to be a part of this project? And if they respond, talk to them and say, this is what it's about. How do you feel? What's your definition of success in this community? What are your feelings about imposter syndrome in whatever way you want to interpret that in relation to being in the glass field? And I have found that it's a big ask, asking people to be very vulnerable, especially when they have no idea who I am. I've never met them in person, but I've had some good responses, I think, from the people who I've reached out to. And it really makes me think about a book that I really loved growing up, The Foot Book by Dr. Seuss, and thinking about how many, many feet you meet within the glass community and how ultimately at the end of the day, and I found through this project that I've been trying to do, it seems like a lot of people in this community are very accepting, and it's just a matter of being willing to reach out and connect. And it seems like everyone knows everybody in this community, which I think is great. And I'm really excited, especially being here at Wheaton, to see how many, many more feet I will get to meet. So thank you very much for joining and listening to my artist talk.
Thanks, Kayla. That was great. We do have a couple questions that I'm going to pose to you. I just want to, while we do that, I want to remind everybody that if you have questions, now's the time to type them into the Q&A feature. This question goes back to the consumption piece. Someone has asked, did you intend the two meanings of consumption as in to consume, as well as the old name for tuberculosis, which leaves you rail thin?
No, I did not. So my intention with this piece was, I was reflecting on past experiences I had growing up. So I come from a very heavyset family, and I was often put on diets from a very young age, and I often did have to keep a food journal. So this was my way of reflecting on those past experiences, and instead trying to maybe make not even a parody, or make it funny intentionally, like if you watched it, because it is very intense. It was very intense whenever I made the piece. I was very uncomfortable doing it, sitting there in my underwear in front of people online eating a whole cake. And yeah, I think it was just my way of trying to process past experiences and try to flip it into a new perspective. But thank you. I hadn't considered the original definition of tuberculosis. I'll keep that in consideration for sure.
The next question is, you often exploit glass-like materials or make other materials behave in a glassy way, like making things melt, drip, congeal, etc. Can you talk more about glass as a starting point for working with other materials? And what is it about glass to you that makes it so perfect for making work about the body?
I might have to break that up into a couple sections. That was a long question. I like it though. I like it. So as a starting point for glass, the way I think about it is, again, this idea of I can always go back home. Glass is home for me, but I don't necessarily think that so far for me, glass is the perfect material in the sense that it is imperfect by nature, and it within itself, it wants to do its own thing. we force it to do something that it naturally doesn't want to do. If we make something very pristine, like a square, naturally hot glass doesn't want to do that. It wants to be round. It wants to collect to itself. It wants to be soft. And something that I try to think about whenever I use this material is that right now it is the perfect material for me because I relate to it. People are fragile. We're also durable in our own way. If we get dropped, we might bounce back. We could also break a bone. We could also break mentally, things along those lines. But I can't sit here and say that in 10 years from now, glass will still be the perfect material, because I might identify more with another material in the future. Pam, was there another section to that question?
Yeah, let me review it really quick. Well, can you talk more about glass as a starting point for working with other materials? I guess that's where the one section that we have to address.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So it being a starting point, I realized that there is glass in everyday life. Of course, there's windows, but there's also this idea of fiber optics. It's in our phones, it's in our screens, it's everywhere. But I like to relate materials of its idea of malleability, the idea of transparency, or sometimes a lot of the time it can be opaque. So I think about how other materials like latex shares that potential. Like it too can be flexible. It too can be opaque if you layer it on thick enough, or how thin you layer it on. It could also be very see-through. So I just try to find common ground.
Nice. This is a sort of a follow-up question to that one. You are using many different materials in your work, and you are achieving results that can be connected visually. How do you, when you're thinking and conceptualizing about a piece that you are going to make, how do you choose which material? Is it a process of play? How do you go about saying, oh, I really want to use this material for that specific concept?
For me, it is a lot about process of play. It takes a very long time for me to make a piece. If I do decide to make something like kiln cast glass, I think about it for a very long time, not just because the glass is expensive. Like, of course, that's a factor. I don't want to waste it, but is it going to do what I need it to do materialistically and conceptually for the most part? I always like to ask myself, what is it doing? What is the material itself doing? Is it acting as a barrier? Is it acting as something that's meant to look heavy? Much like bodies like mine can look heavy. And that's mostly in the instance where I do decide to use kiln cast glass if I need it to look heavy. So.
Great. We have another question that came in. What is the role, or is there a role of drawing in your oeuvre? So does that play a role within your professional practice?
I wish it played more of a role. I will say I'm very bad at sketching stuff out in a notebook. I will write notes, and that's about it. I probably should expand on that. I shouldn't admit that in public, but I am, so.
Well, it seems, and this kind of brings me to another question. It seems that the writing of others plays a role in your creative process. And you had mentioned in the beginning of the talk that you kind of hit a wall of frustration, but you did work through that. And did those writings play a role? And how would you advise others when they perhaps hit the same type of frustration wall? How do you break through that? And what would you tell others to do?
Talk to people. That's the simplest, most direct answer I could give. Is I would not have been able to break through those barriers by myself. And when I say talk to people, I don't mean tell them your whole life story. If you want to, great, that's great. But just asking questions like, hey, I don't understand this certain thing in relation to my practice. And often people notice things that you yourself don't notice. I'm someone who can say like, I know what my practice is about. 100%, that is a lie. I try my best to fully understand, but I overlook things. And it's those moments where people just say, well, this makes me think about this, about your work, and, so on and so forth. That's something that's really helpful. And I would recommend talk to people. And it's usually never coming from a bad place. It's coming from a constructive place. And it's like, you ask the question, we just want to help you. So
nice. We have another question. Have you used glass that may be mirrored or given a layer that changes the inside out dynamic, as well as forcing a viewer to see some of themselves?
I have not yet. That's actually something that I've been wanting to experiment with. It just hasn't happened yet. I have a bunch of ideas written down in relation to mirroring and getting people to actually see themselves and not just like some other person's body, but it's under consideration for sure.
All right. And time for one more question. What are your plans for your creative practice after the fellowship? What's next with your work?
What's next with really just expanding on the work that I've been doing and trying to actually finish the work. All the work I do takes a very long time, more than I care to admit, but trying to figure that out, and also, again, figuring out next steps. I can't say that I fully know, because a lot of inspiration for my work comes from happenstance, like the weird mystery wax here at Wheaton. I loved it. It's my favorite wax I've worked with. So that's that's the best answer I can give you right now, a non-answer.
That's perfectly wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you this evening.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's been great.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you, Kayla. This was wonderful. And I just want to say an extra thank you for just sharing so openly and honestly. I loved listening to your entire talk, but I really feel like we all got to know you very well. So thank you for that. Everyone can take a look at the chat for some lovely links and copy and paste those and keep those, and follow Kayla on Instagram. That's in there, and also her website. And thank you, Pam, for your wonderful hosting as usual. I want to let everyone know that we're taking the summer off, and you can check back in August for the fall lineup of Wheaton Conversations. Included in the chat are the links for registration and also the links for the past conversation. So go check that out, and you can always listen again. And Kayla's presentation will be up there soon. So I want to say thank you again for everyone that was here, and good night. Have a great weekend.